Future
Okay.
architects of Middle East.
Future Architects of the Middle East.
Oh, okay, good.
And this is a group that transcends our school here on campus.
Also joined us.
Matt, I don't think I got, I couldn't check my mail recently. I was in class. Did you send me information about the book that you're working on?
It's very brief, Clara. I just sent it about 15 minutes ago.
Can you let me know?
What do you want to do? I mean, I can just tell you what I said.
Yes, please.
It says, Matthew Bell is an architect in practice with Perkins Eastman in DC and professor of architecture at the University of Maryland. He is currently working on a book about the architecture and urban design of cities after catastrophic events. You said to make it short, so I did.
Yes, yes. What's the name of your practice again?
Perkins Eastman.
Shasta, do you know how many people do we have?
Have like 9 people in the waiting room, but I will check. I will check YouTube as well, but we had 35 RCPs.
Mm-hmm.
There's a number of people in the waiting room waiting to be admitted, I noticed.
Yeah. I will start the live, YouTube live, and I'm admitting people.
Uma is here.
Yes.
You have to check on admit.
Yeah, I'm doing it.
Mm-hmm. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. We are here for the second of our dialogues in a series of 4. This one is called Wars and Peacebuilding. What hope can the spatial disciplines provide? This is again the second in a series of 4. The name of the series is Interdisciplinary Dialogue Series, Violence, Conflict, and Space. Peacebuilding contributions from the special disciplines. We had one already on social polarization, and in the spring semester, we're going to have 2 others, one on climate change and disaster, and the second on disrupting slow violence. I'm Clara Irazabal. I'm a professor here in the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation, University of Maryland, College Park, where I also serve as the JEDI officer, Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, leading a JEDI collective that is the one that is offering you this dialogue. And we have a series of wonderful people here that are going to be commenting on the topic of today. But before we get to that, I'm going to go over some ground rules for a respectful dialogue, very briefly. First, constructive and open-minded participation. We call upon not only the speakers and moderators, but also the public at large. Stay on topic. Today, we're discussing the role of our disciplines in contributing to peace building in a context in which we are war-torn all around the world. Respect everybody's voice. Maintain composure and respect. Use the chat respectfully too. No hate speech or discrimination, no sharing of inappropriate content, and follow the moderator's discussion. And the moderator is actually our Grant Professor of Architecture and Urban Design, Matt Bell, here at the School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. He's not only a professor, but a full practitioner of architecture and urban design in his firm Berkins Eastman in DC. And he's currently working on a book that discusses architecture and urban design in cities after catastrophic events. I'm turning it up to him now. Matt.
Well, thanks, Clara. This is a very important topic, and obviously it's topical not only today, but it has been topical, as we all know, throughout history in terms of the history of conflict and the history of human beings building their environments before, during, and after conflict, and what other factors that go into how one conceives of those environments and how they are impacted by conflict. Clara, did we have an order in which everyone was going to go, or what? Did you have an order?
Yes. Well, if it is okay with the speaker, the poster was suggesting an order to have Mohammed, Joseph, and Uma.
All right, then that's how I will introduce them. So let me introduce all of them first, and then we'll get on to their presentation. So Mohammed Gharipur is a distinguished professor in the ACSA. He serves as professor and director of the architecture program at the University of Maryland. He's published 15 books and received awards from prestigious organizations. He's the director and founder of the award-winning International Journal of Islamic Architecture, the director and co-founder of the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative, and the president of the Society of Architectural Historians. After Mohammed, we will hear from Yosef Jabarin, who is a professor of urban planning. He graduated from the Graduate School of Design at Harvard and is a visiting professor at Columbia University. Previously, he was a senior lecturer in the Department of Urban Planning at MIT and a visiting scholar at MIT's Aga Khan program for Islamic architecture. He is a review editor of planning theory and an editor in sustainability and frontiers. His research focuses on state-group relations in the context of spatial planning, sustainability, and climate change. In the context of climate change and justice, his recent books are The Risk City, Cities Countering Climate Change, Emergent Planning Theories and Practices Around the World. His forthcoming book is about the location of social justice in the planning and development of New York City, which is forthcoming in 2025. He has also written books in Arabic, Hebrew, and English, such as Orientalism in Architecture, Hegemonic Planning in Israel, and Planning Under Political Conflict in Jerusalem. And last but not least will be Uma Gupta, who is a student with us at the University of Maryland. She is a active member of two important organizations, NOMAS, the National Organization of Minority Architects Students, and the FAME, which is the Future Architects of the Middle East. Two very, very important organizations relative to the formation of our students as they go forth in the world and hopefully do great and wonderful things. So with that, I'll ask Mohammed to kick us off. And I don't know, Clara, do we want to wait until all the presentations to ask questions, or do we want to ask questions between each one? What's your preference? You're muted. You're muted.
I would think that we have their presentations first, and I will remind them that they shouldn't take more than 8 minutes each.
And then we do each of the presentations, and then I can open it up for questions.
And you can also offer your questions and comments.
And
too.
I will have a few, I'm sure. Okay, very good. So Mohammed, could you please enlighten us?
Good evening. Thank you so much, Clara, for your invitation, and thanks to you and your team for organizing this session, and also to Matt for serving as the moderator. So I'm really happy to be here. Honestly, when I received the invitation for this panel, actually, I had reservations, mainly because it's a tough topic, and partly because of my personal experience with war and the fact that it's not easy to talk about this topic. Uh, I should confess that war from within is profoundly different from seeing it from the outside, and I think this is really important to note. Observing, um, when I was a child and I was being raised in Iran, and in the city of Isfahan when the war was happening, and our city was constantly being attacked by missiles and bombs and all sorts of weapons. So that kind of gave me a different kind of perspective to the war. So, and I think again, growing up during wartime, you actually you witness its psychological and emotional toll that is very different from seeing it outside, and observing actually numerous good people working together to rebuild our cities, our neighborhoods, and build new architecture to create a sense of hope in our cities in Iran. Actually, shaped, a commitment in me to use actually architecture as a tool for healing and rebuilding. Later on. So here, actually, I will be referring to a few of my research projects to give you an idea about how I have tried to actually to kind of give you an idea about how our work can make an impact during and after wars and crisis. So when we teach architectural history, we are often actually focused on styles, on forms, spaces, and shapes. Uh, Another way of looking at architectural history is as a continuum of ruptures and wars and crises and conflicts and disasters and their impact on architecture. So this is a kind of an alternative way that we can look at architectural history, and Matt is already addressing it in his book. In a way, a rupture and crisis is an integral part of any civilization. So nothing is new. Uh, what is about people, and we often forget about that, what is not about necessarily buildings and cities, is mainly about people. And at the core of the work that we do as educators, as architects, we focus on people and we try to address their needs. As Matt mentioned, in 2012, I founded the International Journal of Islamic Architecture. And over the years, we have tried to reflect on what's happening in the Middle East and North Africa, in the Islamic world, and make a contribution to the discourse of architecture. For example, we have published special issues on displacement. This is the cover that you can see here. It's one of the refugee camps in Beirut in Lebanon, and the destruction of architectural heritage and the notion of rupture in the Islamic world. And another project of mine is actually Epidemic Urbanism Initiative. Right at the beginning of the COVID crisis, my friend and colleague Caitlin de Klerk and I, we co-founded the Epidemic Urbanism Initiative as a way of kind of studying, creating a hub for people from different fields to study the impact of epidemics and pandemics on cities. And now I'm happy to tell you that we have members from 91 countries who have been part of many workshops, design competitions, and many, many events that we have organized over the years. And this is the reason that I'm talking about this, is that this is the kind of advocacy work that we as architects or educators can do to foster communication. In a way, again, as we as architects and planners leverage moments of destruction to rebuild hope and resilience. This is our ultimate goal. And a great example of, I mean, is actually what my colleague Matt Bell is working on, and hopefully he will have a chance to talk about his book and especially the work that he's doing with cities in Ukraine to kind of rebuild and these cities after hopefully after the war is over. Sacred precincts that, I mean, this you see the cover of one of my books, Sacred Precincts. This is actually, it was a 5-year project that I worked on. And I did it with the help of 29 scholars from many different countries, scholars and practitioners. And our goal was actually to document non-Muslim sacred sites in the Islamic world. Why I found it important? Because many of them were being destroyed or they were not being and they were being kind of under threat of destruction. I even sent a copy of this book to President Obama, um, um, and that was right at the beginning of the ISIS crisis. And I urged him actually to take an action and to preserve some of these sites. So unfortunately, after the ISIS crisis, 5 specific sites that we studied in this volume completely were completely destroyed. So that shows us, how urgent these kinds of scholarly projects are. So and also it can give you an idea about the kind of work that we can do as protectors of the built environments and as advocates of the built environment. Another project of mine is documenting the Jewish quarter of Isfahan, and this is actually this is in 2012 when I was visiting the Jewish quarter, and I noticed that one of the old synagogues of this quarter was completely in ruins, and it really saddened me that this beautiful kind of heritage is being kind of neglected. So that's why I decided to work on a comprehensive documentation project to document all these synagogues in um, in the Jewish quarter of Isfahan. So uh, just to summarize my observations, I think that we as educators, architects, planners, again as advocates of people, as advocates for people and the built environment, can do many things to make an impact, and that could be through collaborating with other experts, recreating safe spaces, preserving cultural heritage, facilitating healing and empathy. And this is an ultimate goal for many of us, that we want our architecture to be about healing and also empowering communities. Thank you so much. I hope it didn't exceed the limit that I had.
Thank you, Mohammed. That was a very good introduction and overview to some of the issues that face us today. Next, we have Professor Yosef Jabarin, who I mentioned before is a professor of urban planning and has degrees from all over the world and lectured in very many places, and certainly has a unique perspective on the issue of both climate change and social justice relative to cities. So, Professor Jabarin, you're on mute, so you might need to unmute. Can you? Yeah, there you go. You're on mute.
Yeah. I see. Yeah, just a minute. Yeah. Yes, thank you very much for, I will make it full screen in a minute, but thank you very much for this invitation. It's an important invitation. I was lucky also 2 weeks ago to speak in SESP in the Conference of the Schools of Planning, and I was surprised that it was about the war and planning in Israel, Palestine. So this is the people will becoming more and more aware of these important things. I'm like a little bit like sort of like Muhammad in terms of I was born in Israel as for a Palestinian family, uprooted family, which lost all of its lands in 1948. Most of it become refugees. And I was grown up as a citizen of Israel. And I think from early age, I was listening to my communities, to the Palestinian communities inside Israel and then in the West Bank and Gaza. And I was aware of the term spatiality and space and land confiscation and how it's important for the people. And when you lose it, what's going on then? And so this brings me to the world of planning simply because I had the feeling as a kid that I need to protect my community. And this is the things that really I decided to do when I grow up, to protect communities in terms of the tyranny of states. So then I become, I work in social justice and I developed some concepts related to spatiality and state planning, such as spaces of trust and spaces of risk. So my main argument in this lecture, in this session, is that violence, in fact, as well as peace building, are both concepts of spatiality, which means we may understand violence in terms of spatiality as an action with social and political intentions and strategies. So I conceive spatiality as populated with politics and ideologies and never naive. Planning and spatial planning and architecture are never naive. I just a few weeks ago, I published a paper about architecture, dispossessive architecture, the dark rule of planning of architecture in dispossessing and displacing people. So spatiality is about ethical judgment, and therefore spatiality, our focus this night, is a powerful intervention and manipulation of spaces and places, and it has the power to produce new realities along a wide spectrum of realities, of binaries. So spatiality.
Can you share your screen in full presentation mode?
So yes. Yeah, so it has the power, spatiality has the power to produce spaces of risk where people feel vulnerable. And on the other hand, spatiality has the power to produce spaces of trust and spaces of recognition and spaces of hope and spaces of human dignity. So we have the power of spatiality, and the way states use it and apply it, it's very important. It's not only during the wars or in conflict area, deeply conflict areas such as Palestine and other places, but also architectural practices and planning practices do it through urban regeneration, urban renewal, etc. So we have this rule of the dark rule of planning and architecture. At the same time, we have the bright light rule, the advanced rule of spatiality that produce spaces for the people. And when you have conflict, it has the power also to produce, we'll speak about it later, spaces of recognition. And this could be achieved by spatiality. So I want to give a little bit of, just to give you how the rule of speciality has been used by the state of Israel in the case of Israel Palestine, and then to end with in Gaza in the 5 minutes that I have. So just this is a background, important background. I will tell. This is Haifa, city where I live in Israel, Palestine, and this city was, with a majority of Palestinians, modern cities, like many other cities in Palestine, like Jaffa, Akka, Lod, many. All of these cities mostly were evacuated and their population become refugees everywhere. So the Palestinian was a modern nation, a nation under the modernization process during the British colonization till 1948. All the urban life of Palestinians were their lives in urban area were cut in a minute, 1948. And then, as Edward Said said in 1948, it was the rise of the Palestinian question, the question of Palestine, and the majority of Palestinians become refugees. And Israel was established according to the UN resolution. The UN resolution suggested to have two states, Israel and Arab state, which should be the Palestinian state, as we see in the map. However, Israel was established, the Palestinian state was not established. The war erupted and the Palestinians become refugees. All what we know today in Gaza, 75% of the population of Gaza are refugees from within Israel today. Then Israel used for many decades, Israel has been destroying the urban fabric of Palestinians. This is Wadi Salib in Haifa, the Crest neighborhood in Haifa. It is under demolition. It has very fantastic Palestinian architecture. However, so Israel has been using planning for two matters. One is to have the territorial control over the entire country. And the second one is to determine the demographic distribution of people, where to live. In fact, to distribute the Jewish nation everywhere in the state. This, what we are seeing here, is the first national plan of Israel, which was designed by 187 professionals who directly worked in the Prime Minister office in 1948. This plan was finished in 1951. It, in fact, controlled the entire country. And then many other professional plans, green plans, many other national plans, in fact, take control of the country and the population and decide every single place, designated every single place for with demographic and political ends. The end of this thing, what the people in the United States, and most people don't know this part of my research, published research, then we have today more than 940 settlements in Israel with 0 Palestinians. Each one of these places has a selection committee where me myself have no right. I have no right to live in one of these places. Imagine the United States, you cannot live in such places. So planning has been doing this thing at the same time, not only inside Israel today, but also in the West Bank. All these dots, the blue dots, are planned settlements according to the state plan in 1978. And today the West Bank is full of settlements. East Jerusalem, 43% become, the state in fact confiscated 68% of the land, become green in East Jerusalem with many settlements. And today we have fragmented, as the plans, fragmented ghettos of Palestinians, cantons here and there in the West Bank. And we have also in Gaza.
Yeah, buddy.
I will finish.
Thank you.
I will finish in Gaza, in fact. So today in Gaza, we have almost, as published according to the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, the vast majority, we have witnessing herbiciding in Gaza. The vast majority of houses are destroyed. Today we have 192,000 orphans as a result of this war in Gaza. And we have also a plan. The new state plan suggests simply to come back, to try to transfer as much as residents of Gaza, now it's happening in north of Gaza, and to have a new settlements. And this, to finish, this idea of the tyranny of spatiality, and the way states sometimes in conflict like this in Israel-Palestine use spatiality is dramatic. And this, imagine on the other side, imagine that we have planners and architects who say, stop, we need to rethink this type of spatiality. So thank you.
Thank you, Youssef. Certainly, your personal perspective is a remarkable experience for any human being, and we appreciate you bringing those thoughts to us. We turn now to Uma Gupta to share her thoughts, and then I'll put a few questions out there and see how we go. So Uma, unmute yourself and take it away.
Oh, thank you so much, Professor Bell, for the introduction, and Dr. Arazabal for having me. Dr. Garipur and Professor Jabareen did a really great job of touching on some of the things that I'm going to try to talk about a little bit further. So I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen and try to get in present mode. You'll have to let me know if you're able to see everything.
We can.
Okay, wonderful. All right.
You may want to make make your images big. Very good. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Thanks so much. I'm going to try to talk super fast because I went a little lengthy with the information I provided, in part to try to explain, why I've come to the conclusions I've come to in my process as a student. So I hope that my unique position as a student today can help illuminate the need for evolution within our educational and pedagogical approaches as they relate to today's topic of conflict neutrality and political turmoil. So I want to focus on some resources and frameworks that have shaped my view of education in our field and have helped me answer the question of who am I to speak up and who am I to try to get students activated, as well as professors and administrators in addition. So I will be situating my discussion within the timeline of the ongoing occupation and violence in Palestine, which is a context that has deeply informed and permanently altered my understanding of our work in the spatial disciplines. And I believe it's also one that has awakened a new and urgent awareness across our generation of the slow violence that exists, both hidden and evidently ongoing within our fields and institutions. I'm going to look at some of the works of critical intellectuals like Edward Said, James Baldwin, Paulo Freire, Malcolm X, and Frantz Fanon to help remind us of the power held in each of our roles within the academy, whether this is as a student, a researcher, an administrator, or as an educator. And these same imperatives must specifically be applied to architecture and the spatial disciplines at large in the form of a critical theory that encourages active engagement with politics and oppression. Student work has often been the first to contend with this responsibility and provides a pathway forward to those who are willing to listen. And I hope that will be members of our field one day. So in the process of asking whether or not it is our right or our role to speak up as students or members of the academy, I've often turned to the teachings and writings of Edward Said, who, in following the practice of Malcolm X and James Baldwin, asserts that the role of the intellectual is to oppose the status quo. He acknowledges that we often feel powerless in the face of an overwhelmingly powerful network of social authorities. These can include the media, government, and corporations. However, in repetition of Fanon's words, he says that when we render and relegate ourselves to the role of a silent witness, we become both cowards and traitors. And this selective silence has become the norm since October 7th. conscientious work of intellectuals occurs when we work to unearth the forgotten, to make connections that were denied, and to cite alternative courses of action that could have avoided war and its attendant goal of human destruction, which is something that you, Professor Jabreen, talk about when you say there's a light alternative to the dark constructions that we have often interacted with. And this conscientious unearthing and critique, one that centers life over the machinery of destruction, remains the task of the intellectual today, and can, per Paulo Freire's guidance, only unfold with success in the form of a critical and non-neutral education. To acknowledge this is to establish a critical theory of architecture, and has become the work of Y Think Tank and Cruz Garcia alongside Natalie Frankowski. They have become critical intellectuals that many student organizations have been following through their workshop frameworks and anti-racist architectural manifestos. Using Louis Kahn's lecture on the brick, they contrast a conventional form of theory with a critical one. As many of us might be familiar with, Kahn's conventional theory follows the path of one saying to a brick, "What do you want, brick?" To which the brick responds, "I like an arch." A critical theory of architecture, however, demands, per Y's writing, more engagement with the world than a mere question about form or craft. It would consider who made the brick, how it was funded, and from which land it was extracted. A critical approach would also ask, what oppressive or liberatory structure or action is this brick going to be a part of? Will the brick be launched at an invading military tank? Will it become part of an illegal apartheid wall? Or will it become part of a new private prison complex? Cruz and Frankowski further exemplify critical architectural theory in contrasting it with what they call cowardice as architectural theory, a practice we witness when educators and academics remain silent, decidedly disengaged from the critical realities of our practice and curricula, while also attempting to silence and repress those who speak up. This silence is summarized by theory in apolitical discussions about ecology, so-called autonomy of architecture, gentrified real estate, decontextualized preservation, or representational aesthetics that ignore architecture's imbrication with white supremacist, heteropatriarchal, and colonial regimes. In response, critical architectural theory offers a framework for education that acknowledges, counters, and deconstructs the power structures within which we create, offering instead a pathway towards life-affirming imaginaries and alternatives, and calling for interdisciplinary collaboration between planning, real estate development, preservation, and architecture together. Critical theory is not just looking at how elements of race theory, feminist theory, and post-colonial theory intersect with our fields or provide a parallel framework, but it is also a direct confrontation with their use and perversion in order to engage with violence within the constructed realm we create. Repression and silence are actively countered by the constructive efforts of student bodies across the nation. Each of the following examples directly confront some aspects of cowardice as architectural theory through the introduction of enacted critical frameworks. The increased repression, surveillance, and intimidation with which these programs are often met also reminds us that cowardice as theory today remains alive and well, upheld at many levels within our academy. I want to start by taking a look at what is the No Mas Open letter that our UMD chapter penned in January of last year. It was meant to serve as a call to action based on critical analysis of the violence enacted directly by our fields, as well as their potential to be maneuvered into spaces of liberation. Our statement was inspired by many that came before it, specifically from Yale NOMAS and other student bodies across the nation. Today, we continue to see such statements be released from the UK with Architects for Gaza and the Architects Against Apartheid coalition, which I shared earlier. Each of these statements that continues to be circulated provides a clear alternative to false neutrality or silence within the spatial disciplines. I also want to take a look at the poster reading list from the Secret Poster Club at the Columbia Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation. In addition to sharing reading lists, they've organized exhibitions in the city, often forcibly relegated to organize outside of the school. Despite the provision of valuable material for all students within the school, they have reported on increased surveillance, punitive punishment, and the destruction of their posted artifacts. Next, I want to look at the NOMAS teach-in that we hosted in collaboration with FAME and UMD SJP. This is in response to an education that many students feel is not being received within our classrooms. Our teach-in was part of a vision that actualized critical and cross-cultural modalities of spatial education, encouraging students to not only conceptualize conceptually unify diverse conflicts across the globe, it also encouraged them to tie them back to elements of planning, preservation, development, and design, as well as an identification of our responsibility to work towards liberations through our fields. Finally, I want to look at a beautiful example of creativity and design in opposition to silence. After meeting with the incredible student president of Princeton NOMAS, I was reminded of Kwame Ture, who taught that revolution cannot solely be concerned with destruction. It requires conversation around creation, building, creating. He said that creation is the first part of revolution, and we in our fields are in a unique position to heed this reminder. Students at Princeton NOMAS created the following installation to encourage sensory and emotional engagement with the horrors unfolding in Gaza. This immersive experience gave students and staff across the university a chance to come together and mourn, an emotional space that has rarely been provided to those witnessing the devastation across Palestine. We desperately need such contextual creation to inform the foundation of our practices, and this can often start in the space of protected exhibitions within our schools. In conclusion, I will say that while we as students can provide all of this outside of the classroom, it is on our educators to bring it within our institutions. When we are silent out of fear or that we might lose our jobs and positions, we have already in effect abandoned part of the responsibility enacted by these positions themselves. To be in any academic position, student, educator, or otherwise, is to constantly struggle, challenge, and speak up on injustice as it relates to our fields in the most urgent matters of the time. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Uma. That was very, very thought-provoking, and obviously, you put a great deal of thought and consideration and clearly activity into many of these things you're dialoguing about. I guess to open this up to take turns having people respond, I want to go back to the question that was posed by the paragraph discussing the content of this seminar, which says that, well, it feels like architecture, urban planning, and real estate development cannot prevent war, and maybe that's debatable. They can play vital roles in emergency response and reconstruction. This prompts key questions. What lessons from these fields offer hope? Which strategies should be sustained and expanded? And I think that's an interesting place to start, because I think one of the things I've always believed about architecture and design is that it's fundamentally, and I could be wrong, and maybe there are reasons why it might not be, but my sense about it, at least in my own personal experience, has been that architecture is an optimistic, and urban design is an optimistic thing. It's something that one does to make people's lives better. Listening to Yusuf a little bit about the spatiality and control of space, in terms of the planning and the political ways in which planning has been pursued in some states, like his experience in Israel, sort of brings maybe some of that to question. So maybe the quick question to start with is this really, what lessons from these fields that we're all involved in terms of architecture, planning, and urban design, offer us lessons about hope, and what strategies maybe we should seek to embrace moving forward, and in terms of how we deal with this problematic world we're in right now. So maybe we'll go from last to first here, and I'll ask Uma maybe to reflect a little bit upon that question first.
Sure, I think that's such an important question. Actually, one of the first teach-ins that I went to was by the Funambulist magazine, and it was led by an architect, Leopold Lambert, and he said that architecture has only ever served to colonize in terms of immediacy. For example, if you walk into a prison or if you walk through a checkpoint, you are directly colonized by the space you inhabit. But he said there is more work that's required for architecture to decolonize you. And architecture can never be inherently decolonial simply through walking into a space. But I, however, think that if you view architecture in exclusion, you lose hope in the sense that, well, okay, a building itself is not going to decolonize me. But if we start looking at some of the planning practices or the historical preservation practices that spatial disciplines offer in united fronts, then I think you do start finding a room for all three of these levels, which include policy, and they include both the past and the future, to provide liberation. So for example, like Professor Jabarine said that some of the planning going on is exclusionary in Haifa or in the plan to colonize Gaza. But if we're looking at a decolonized Gaza, we look at a geospatial perspective, like the creation of a map that doesn't have colonially drawn borders. Then we look at the historical preservation, if we can preserve artifacts like churches and sacred spaces that Dr. Garibur talked about. And then we talk about an architectural perspective, which is to rebuild and create safe homes for people who have been displaced from their land. So I hope that wasn't too long, but I think everything in cooperation is what gives us hope, but each aspect without context and exclusivity provides, limiting options for freedom.
Interesting. Professor Jabarine, care to reflect upon that question?
Yes. In fact, you are right. Architecture, design, and planning all are about ethical judgments. It's in any. I believe that in any drawing, if you design a street or setback of a building, any tiny micro, to be any micro line in the space is about politics, and it has ethical judgment, and it's impact people, and it is powerful in terms of what it can do to other people, to the people. So I suggest, in order to understand what's going on in schools and in other faraway places like Gaza and other places like in Sudan, conflicts in Sudan there, and who cares about, at the end of days, we have 192,000 orphans. It's far away from us. I believe that first we need to learn what's going on in the American schools, what's going on in terms of conflict in New York City, in London, in Maryland, in Baltimore, everywhere, first of all here. Because what's going on here, this is part of my book about New York City, and I believe that conflict between the state and groups is everywhere. It depends on the intensity and the sphere of the conflict. So imagine we have today, the city of New York produces many maps of displacement. The same maps we have it in London, the same maps we have in Rome and in Paris, maps of displacement of people who are displaced by the job of architecture and planners, by urban renewal and urban regeneration. And also, Matt, we have violent urbanism everywhere, from the redlining to up to date. We have color urbanism. Color urbanism in New York City, where I stay here, is also about violence. It's about violence. So what we need is to decolonize our projects, our cities, first of all, because what's going on in Gaza, it's in high intensity. It's crazy. It's unbelievable. But these things of displacement and conflicts are happening here. And I'm looking for the grace in planning and spatiality, the empathy, and then to deconstruct this color and violent urbanism here and there, everywhere. It's happening everywhere. It's here in our neighborhoods. It's happening here where I live now in Manhattan, everywhere. We feel it, we smell it. So in this sensibility, I suggest that I agree with every single word Uma said, is that we need also to rethink our teaching and our projects, our seminars, and our studios. It's there in the studios should be to decolonize this violent urbanism and all of this idea, and to teach for more critical thinking and the role of the architect as an intellectual. I took it from Uma, the architect as an intellectual who care about blacks and whites, red and yellow, whatever, all the colors. So this is my comment to your question.
Well, I have a follow-on question, but maybe what we'll do is we'll go to Mohammed for his take on what lessons from these fields offer hope and which strategies should be sustained and expanded, and then we'll come back in a little bit of some questions I'd like to put out to you all.
Thank you, Matt, and thank you, Yusuf and Uma, for your wonderful presentations. I think if we look at the world and what's happening out there, there are numerous reasons to be pessimistic and hopeless. And let's be honest that our impact could be limited, is limited. However, I want to remind us that, again, the work that we do, the work that Uma does as an architect matters. I mean, the fact that he's educating many of us, the students, the work that Yusuf is doing through this panel and many other presentations that he has, his research projects. So that's why I think I see a lot of hope and optimism through the work that we are doing. What I want to emphasize here is that we are also living in a very polarized world. And I mean, the big question always for me as an educator and as a researcher is how to bring everyone together. And whether we should try to bring everyone together, I mean, whether that's the ultimate goal or not, because I mean, we may not actually end up being at the point that people are agree on many things. I mean, we are all, at the end of the day, we all live in our silos. We live in our tribes. That's the reality of the world. I think what really helps in this process is I'm a strong believer in public education through our scholarship, through the work that we are doing. It's important that we go beyond, again, the silos of educators and architects, and we talk to the public. I think that part can really make an impact. And we have to stay optimistic. Thank you.
So it's interesting to think about this question of moving forward. And this question of because we're obliged to. These wars, believe it or not, will end. There will be some resolution, whether we like how they are resolved or not, they will end. And these communities that have been destroyed, like many in the past, will be rebuilt. I guess my question is, because I'm an architect, I'm a formalist, I deal with built things, with things you can go up and kick and put your arms around and stuff. Is there a formal corollary to these things? In other words, when Thessaloniki was rebuilt in 1917 after a tremendous fire, they fundamentally obliterated the Arab and the Jewish quarters because the Orthodox population had just taken over Salonika and wanted to make it a Greek city, an Orthodox Greek city. And the spatial relationships that had existed previously, but for the Arabs and for the Jewish populations, which were quite robust, were fundamentally eliminated and not rebuilt. So that was a very deliberate political act, but it was rebuilt in a sort of traditional architectural manner. We've seen modern architecture after World War II embraced by very different ideologies, by the East Germans and the West Germans, by East Berlin and West Berlin and things. Is there a spatial sort of idea of what our city should look like moving forward that we can identify, that we can talk about, that we feel may offer us the possibility of hope and the possibility of hope and equity in a society? Does that exist? Or is that just me as an architect being extremely naive and, overly optimistic?
Yeah. You want me to put it?
Yeah, please go ahead. Go ahead. Sure.
I think this is very important question. Last month, 4 weeks ago, I was invited to a workshop in Doha with about 50 Palestinians, most of them from Gaza and from the West Bank. Most of them are work with the civil society and intellectuals, professors and scholars here and there, and we heard the story of Gaza, about the demolition of all the universities. In 1 minute, no universities. Scholars were killed, physicians, doctors, nurses, everywhere. Killing is everywhere. But I was during this, and there I heard what I couldn't understand as a human is the 192,000 of orphans. Because I have 2 kids and I feel like, oh, wow, to take care of them in these days, it's like crazy. And within this violence, Gaza as Nagasaki, Nagasaki as Gaza. So you need to rethink. And there my argument was Mahmoud Darwish, Tawfiq Ziyad, a Palestinian leader from Nazareth, who wrote that get rid of your deads and stand up and start your new journey. So this he told the Palestinians after the 1967 war. And he said, we need to bury your deads and go up and stand up. So what we need, I told them that we need to rethink the post-war reconstruction of Gaza. And this post-reconstruction must address all the parameters of orphans, of welfare, of health, of universities. Matthew, can you imagine kids in Gaza and students were not in the schools in the last 2 years? And this Gaza is the largest prison on the earth, like more than 2 million people there. So I suggest at that meeting, and here I suggest that we need to rethink how to rebuild Nagasaki of Gaza again. You mentioned the European Reconstruction Project as Marshall and other projects. So people in Britain, in Great Britain and France, the people were looking for food. The first element of the reconstruction was to secure food. That's what we need in Gaza, to secure food and build Gaza to be a city for its people. And here we have many critical issues, such as who need to own these projects. Is it the IMF or the World Bank or the people themselves? The people to rewrite their city again, to rewrite Gaza again according to their basic inspiration and to protect themselves, etc. So, to finish with this thing that since 1948 till now, there are many families in Gaza who have been refugees with this journey of refugeeism for 4 and 6 times. You can't continue like this. You can't just bring women from the United States and make another Nagasaki, another one and another one every day. You can't do it. So this is why this session here in Maryland, in this university, and this session is very important in the sense that we need to bring all of these thoughts again and again and to rethink our responsibility, because we are responsible and you are responsible also. It's part of you. So yes, I believe that as architects and planners, we need to rethink how to give hope. One comment about the reconstruction, the project of reconstructing Iraq cost about $212 billion, and it is a big, huge fail. And to bring the new Iraq, the new democratic Iraq is not there. And the new democratic Middle East, based on the reconstruction idea, it failed. So what we need to rethink of reconstructing of Beirut today, and reconstructing of Gaza, and reconstructing of cities in Korean and in the borders with Russia, etc. All of these places. We need to bring this topic of reconstruction again and again critically to think of it in terms of peace building and critical thinking. Thank you.
Uma, any thoughts on that question?
Sure. So I think a really important question of like city development is who you're building for. And I think that's something that was explored a lot in that critical versus, you know, architectural theory versus a conservative architectural theory. And one of the examples that I think about a lot that is in, you know, the construction of predominantly Black cities in America tend to be desiccated of green space, and they tend to have, you know, wider streets and limited, you know, a lot of legislation on noise, a lot of legislation on public gathering. And in that case, you're building for one of those powers that Edward Said talked about, which is the government, the media, a corporation, as opposed to the inhabitants of the actual space that's going to be lived in. And I think I was actually in Dr. Garipur's class. It was like one of the first readings that we did in his class on epidemic urbanism. I want to say that it was the life and death of American cities, but they took a case study of a city in Boston, like the immigrant quarter in Boston, and looked at organic growth and how oftentimes the cities that grew organically, that were houses built on top of houses, tended to have greater success rates than the ones that were planned from an external perspective of someone who doesn't live there. And I think you have to build with the aims of, you know, community of the public with whom you're working. I think that's like a very general known fact. But again, in practice, you look at, are you rebuilding for easier surveillance? Are you rebuilding for easier access of the outsider? Or are you rebuilding for a better life of the individual? And then one thing I'll throw in at the end is there's the case in Algeria during the colonization of Algeria of boulevard construction, which is oftentimes something that marks the beginning of a city. It happened in Paris. Many years ago, there was, you know, the Great Boulevard in Paris was used to separate proletariat neighborhoods and create a binary in the city. And the same thing was done in Algeria, where you come in and you destroy the quarters of people and immigrants who are living there, much like you talk about the destruction of the Arab and Jewish quarter. And then you try to build on top of it after invasion with these new form boulevards and these spatial constraints that just don't make any sense for the local needs. So again, I think if you're constructing with the vision of organic growth and the vision of the local people and those who will inhabit the space, as opposed to those who will forcibly enter the space, I think that's a good premise for like trying to move forward.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. At least, you know, when I think back to what I know about Nazi Germany and the rebuilding of Germany, there was a huge kind of question, of course, about the extent to which they should rebuild buildings that look German. And there's some very interesting studies that have been done of the cities that became Polish after the war that have been German, like Breslau became Wrocław, and lots of questions about who they're building it for, and the question of the identity of the city, and a very, very interesting sort of conundrum about how to rebuild the architecture that gave the Polish inhabitants an identity, not just the Germans, because it was much longer a German city than was a Polish city, or at least there was overlap. And so those questions about who you're building for is a really super important one. But of course, we also know over time, sometimes who a city is built for originally becomes something else. You know, and that's a sort of another problem as well. You know, we know many places that were like Spain, for example, which was fundamentally, you know, built by the Arabs in southern Spain and Andalusia, but of course now it's not inhabited by those people.
Yeah.
Through an act of violence, you know, the expulsion of the Moors by Ferdinand and Isabel. I guess the question becomes, you know, do we have a right to remain optimistic that we can help as architects and designers? And what is the best approach for us to take. You said, question who you're building for, make sure you understand what their needs are. Are there, you mentioned the sort of preference for the organic city versus the planned city, things like that. Are there any other parameters that we should be aware of relative to these kinds of issues when we're really talking about reconstruction, particularly after things are so fresh, in our political minds?
Matt, I want to just add a couple of things that have to do with what you are discussing here. The first one is that you can always reconstruct the city, but you cannot reconstruct the community. So if the community is gone for many reasons, there is no way to rebuild it. So again, I want to stay optimistic, but also realistic. This happened in southern Iran after the war, where eventually after 8 years of horrendous war, which is in no way even comparable to what's happening in Gaza. Unfortunately, people ended up not going back there. So the cities are almost gone. The cities are on the map, but all these fabulous cities that were the centers of, commerce and tourism in Iran, in southern Iran, actually in 70s, they don't exist anymore. So that actually shows us how important this post-war or the notion of the post-war community is. And of course, there is no easy solution for that. The other thing that you mentioned, which is, I think, very important here, is that whose heritage are we talking about? Because let's say, a city, in southern Spain that was inhabited by Muslims, Christians, and Jews may have three separate histories that belong to these different communities. And sometimes we have to accept the fact that, this notion of identity is very complicated and history are very complicated when it comes to the history of urbanism and architecture. And there is no easy, answer there. The third one that I want to emphasize here is actually the role that we play as educators in educating architects whose work is ethical and professional. I think ethics play a very important role. And the fact that, I really enjoyed Uma's presentation, because in a way you were trying to say that, you need to look at things outside the box. Ethics matter, it's at the end of the day, we are supposed to remain advocates for people and communities, despite the complexity of this whole issue. And training architects who take these issues seriously. And when we ask them, let's say, to design a building that, is unethical for any reason, they can stand up and say, I can't do it for these reasons. I think this is important. We want our students, our colleagues to be vocal, to be thoughtful, to be intellectual, and to be vocal.
Yeah, thank you, Mohammed. That's an excellent point. I just want to push back on one thing about the community rebuilding. It seemed to me that the rebuilding of Warsaw after World War II was as much about rebuilding the burning embers of what the Germans tried to destroy than it was just the architecture. For them, embedded in the architecture was a cultural history that the Germans were trying to wipe out. And I think for the Poles at that period of time, if just one member of that community survived to see that city rebuilt in that way, it was a victory for them. So it's an interesting way in which architecture conveys those kinds of values in a very direct way.
And by the way, my point was not that you cannot rebuild communities. We are all trying to rebuild communities, but even if you reconstruct buildings, that does not mean that people are going to come back or communities.
There's no guarantee. There's certainly no guarantee.
Exactly.
That's
Yes.
for sure. That's for sure. Okay, Clara, you had told me there was going to be a way for me to access questions people had, but I'm not sure I know how to do that.
Maybe,
Sharsa is managing the chat.
Okay,
You can also open it up for people here in the room.
well, let me do that then. So I've asked some, oh, Joseph, did you want to make a comment and then we'll open up for some other questions, please?
yeah, maybe I feel like when you speak about Andalusia, where Jews and Arabs and others live together, and so I want to say something that it's very important to mention that it is not in the case of Palestine. I think in most of the cases in the world, it is not. These cases are not people against people. It's not nations against nations. You know, I will tell you a secret. Even though I'm a Palestinian, I have never agreed to participate in a conference in Germany. Simply because when I was a kid, my mother, we grown up as a uprooted family, but my mother showed me and father showed me a black and white book about what the Nazis did for the Jews. So from that point, everything is personal, even space is personal, and the Holocaust is personal, and Gaza is personal. So I was attached to the Jewish pain in this sense. It was very important for me. So this what in terms of sensibility in teaching, for example, when you teach like Jewish and Palestinian in the same room, I have like, they are there in the same room that you need to teach and you need to understand to make the dialogue correctly. But at the same time, there is other thing with architecture, which is the can we build a sense of communities, new communities? Is really very important questions, particularly after the death of the massive death and killing. But there are also, maybe I will talk later about it. There are also people by themselves, without architects, like in Palestine, in Haifa city where I live, Jewish and Palestinian people together, they build, they share spaces. They share spaces and live together in many aspects. And they produce sort of hope, which was, even though it has been killed again and again and again, but still there for many decades. So just want to say this, that about it's not groups against groups, it's about the systems of politics. System of politics that does not allow us to live in peace and dignity. It's in the system. So this is why we need always, as said, mentioned the intellectual of Edward Said, who said, following Marx and others, speaking truth to power. So we as architects, we need to speak truth to power in the sense of spatiality and planning. So this is the point.
So one of the questions in here that Mary Cease has put forward here is this question of what would we change about ethical building and design practice in terms of the spatial disciplines, curriculum, and practices. In other words, what sort of things are missing in how we teach today that really ought to be foundational relative to making students aware and making students understand and making students ask the questions that they should ask about, how to be an ethical practitioner in the design disciplines. Where do we start? Where do we burrow in, in those first experiences students have? Any thoughts on that?
I think, Matt, we need to move away from a curriculum or courses that are trying to answer questions, and instead moving towards courses and a curriculum that raises questions and trains students to be, thoughtful leaders. People who are I mean, students who are able to see the complexity around issues and inform us and educate us on what's happening out there. I think in that sense, even though I'm not a fan of, I mean, decolonization in terms of terminology in education, I really enjoyed it when last semester one of the students actually shared some concerns about choosing specific precedent in one of the studios, and I found that question valid and very educational. So this is the kind of two-way education that we can have, so that curriculum is not like the old days about memorizing names and styles, and it becomes more like a venue for two-way conversation.
Yeah, Uma, any thoughts on your education thus far and what you think might be things that should be added or subtracted or modified?
Sure. I'm gonna give like maybe a small scale answer to what is a very large question, but I think that recently I was very lucky to go to the NOMAS conference as part of our role, and I had the chance to catch up with a student who's now working for a very large design firm. And this student was once a part of NOMAS and was once also very active in following what is our organizational goal of directly interacting with politics and trying to make our field safer for any member of a marginalized, oppressed group and any architect in general, so to have an ethical practice. And they were sharing that the three most recent projects on which they have worked is a stock office in Saudi Arabia and then a prison complex in the United States. And I think I had asked, like, how do you feel that the grant, she's designing as an entry-level architect, probably just certain small aspects of the building. But I had asked, how do you feel about what your project is contributing to at large? And I think just a couple of days before, there had been a huge audit of the labor industry in Saudi Arabia and how many of the NEOM and other projects are impacting unethical labor practices to rapidly build infrastructure. And another conversation I had at NOMAS was actually when I was at the graduate fair, and different graduate programs were comparing what their programs offer. And it was really interesting because I know there's a lot of competition. Again, I'm not an expert, but I know there's a lot of competition between SciArc and UCLA as a program. And something that stood out to me a lot was when UCLA was advertising their studio program, they said, we interact hands-on with the community around us. So what we do in studio is meant to tackle a real social issue that occurs in the urban scape of LA, versus SciArc is very much form and aesthetic based. And I'm not saying it doesn't provide a very valuable and necessary skill set for a designer, but I will say that no one is just generating a floating form. And I think a lot of the publications that we saw require students who the art school publications we saw require students to publish a blurb about where their building is located and why they built it. And I think in studio, if we have a critical thought of not just, okay, you're building like a random, I understand in introductory studios, it serves the purpose of a very abstract design, but I also feel that in introductory studios, if we integrate writing and study of history and part of the projects, that becomes the foundation from which you jump into all design projects. And all design projects are not just localized, they relate to a context upon which they're built and the people they affect after they're built. So I think in studio, we need to start asking people to provide a bit more like history and location-based context, and that can really make a big difference, and talk about where our precedents are.
So,
Yeah.
Clara, anybody in the conference room want to offer some thoughts or questions?
Yeah, we have a question from our audience. Mary asks that following on Uma's charge on critically rethink architectural planning, and I would add preservation education to build a more ethical building and design practice. Would anyone like to comment on what needs to change in the spatial disciplines, curriculum, and practices? Where would you start?
Yeah, may I take it, Matt?
Please.
Yeah, thank you. Look, but when I was a student, I entered the Graduate School of Design at Harvard as a Marxist. student, and I end up being a capitalist. And there they taught me you need to think of how to create jobs. Only capitalism can create jobs. And the studios were, the main idea of studios were what type of building you need. The question was the return on equity. This is the main things. So I think this thing are part of the, are part today of many departments, schools here and in Europe and everywhere in the world. So what is missing? This is why this question is important. What is missing is to go back again and to rethink the concept of deconstruction. By deconstruction, I mean to deconstruct the plans themselves, to teach students, to teach ourselves how to deconstruct lines and colors and plans and colors of plans, to deconstruct them and understand what underneath these structures, buildings, etc., in terms of power, in terms of dichotomies, in terms of binary thinking, in terms of who is benefit from these things, who are not, who are excluded, what is, because all of these things, every single project, architectural project, is try to tell us that this is the proper way of doing things. And we need to deconstruct this proper thinking again and again in order to understand what's going on underneath in terms of powers and relations. And this what to say that green, when I see, for example, green colors in plans in Israel, I get frightened. I couldn't sleep that night because green in this color, the color of green in these plans means land confiscation from Palestinians, communities, and others. So this type of, we need to go back and develop the conception of deconstruction again and again in order to bring, because it's not enough to think of history and the context of places. We need analytical tools of deconstruction, and not to keep this deconstruction conception back in the 90s and 80s of big thinkers. No. I want to bring it back here today to reconceptualize it in terms of how to tell ourselves and students to deconstruct plans, to understand what's going on underneath this. But this is what important at the end of the day, if you want to deconstruct powers and understand power and plans and all of these things. So I think this is might be one of the recommendation that I come with that we reached this night.
One of the dilemmas and challenges, I think, in terms of what you teach people, is that a great deal of, in my opinion, a great deal of what students learn in their first year or two is based on faith, because they don't know a lot. They have to believe that what they're learning is good for them. But what you have to do along the lines of all that is also teach them critical judgment. And I think critical judgment.
Then we have more questions.
Yeah, we
Yeah,
have more questions.
Yeah, just hold on. Can I just finish my observation, please?
Yes.
I was just going to say that one of the things that I think is really key to education is making sure that students are equipped with an ethical sense, and a number of you have touched on, and critical judgment and the skill sets to be able to apply them to complex situations, so that they can, operate effectively in the context that they're in, and they can read those contexts. That's not an easy thing, at least in my experience with architectural education. That's when you do it well, it's great, but it's a very difficult thing to achieve because there's so much skill building involved in architecture that critical judgment is sometimes something that doesn't get as perhaps as strong a kind of foundation as other things do. So, Claire, what were you going to say here? There's other questions in the room there.
Yes.
Thank you so much for great presentation. It's really informative. I have a question. I was wondering about, for example, if we have a successful planning or successful planning, it's interdisciplinary. They have an interdisciplinary approach. Is it possible to generalize that to all cities or all cities around the world, for example, from Iran or Gaza or other? Look at we have just one approach to solve these problems, or no, we have to look at the context of the cities or the culture or the people who live there or other factors.
I'm sorry. So your question is about, is an interdisciplinary approach something that is
Yeah,
worth pursuing in every context? I'm not sure I totally understood what
yeah,
you
I want to say, for example, we have a successful interdisciplinary approach in other countries. For example, I don't know, is it Colombia or other countries, other cities? We can generalize that to the other countries like Iran or Gaza.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, my experience professionally in the United States is that everything is interdisciplinary. We are collaborating with all sorts of people when we do large projects, with a significant amount of public outreach in terms of talking to people and things. But is that something that is a practical reality, I guess, in Iran or in Gaza? And if not, why not? And if so, how would it proceed? Maybe Mohammed, maybe you could go first, and then Yusuf.
Sure. No, unfortunately, it's not reality in at least I can talk about many parts of the Middle East. We are not there yet. And that's why it's really important to keep reminding architects that they need to work with, number one, experts in other fields, number two, communities. So I think these two are really important.
Yeah, Yusuf, you're muted, sir.
Yeah, two things. One is that we need to detach ourselves from universalism. So there should be no models, defined models for all places. Each place has its own context, etc. And with the idea of reconstruction and post-conflict reconstruction, all of these ideas, I think we need to see from the south as well as to see things from the north. We need to see things through the eyes of Gaza as well as through seeing from Tehran and seeing from Beirut and seeing from Cairo. So we should detach ourselves from this universalism of architecture that is, in terms of context, it's very problematic. Even though what we are witnessing in recent years, that we have the Dubaization project is everywhere. In Amman and everywhere you see these tall buildings almost empty. They are, with huge alienation to the context and culture, etc. But they are there. So I think there is no remedy. There is no one perception for the cities. What we need is to support. I think I suggest to respect the claim that said we need to see from the space itself. This is very important. Then we get ourselves away from Orientalism and all of these ideas. Seeing from the south and seeing from the north, this is the idea of things, I think.
That's a very interesting point of view, I think. Any other questions there, Clara?
May I
And then-
just add something to
Yeah,
what you
please, go ahead,
said, and,
Mohammed, go ahead.
Uma may have other observations, but I think both in the practice of architecture and in the education of architecture, the big question is how can we even keep our focus on marginalized communities in the work that we are doing? I think that's the big question. And these communities vary. I mean, I used to, as you know, Matt, I used to live in Baltimore, and so I observed actually many of these disparities out there. And again, I try to see how I can make a contribution to make things better for these communities. And if we keep it at the center of education and practice, whether we are, you know, educators, professors, students, and professionals, I think that's going to make a change.
I think you make a very interesting point, Mohammed, which is that, you know, any project of reconstruction or any project of any scale in a city is going to have people who have more power and people who have less power. And what we need to do in any of these public processes that certainly I've been part of is to make sure that the voices are given equal opportunity to have their wishes, desires, and concerns met. Not simply the marginalized and not simply the powerful, but everybody. And that the process has to seem legitimate in that everybody has the same opportunity. And when I run big master planning projects, what I always say to people is, if you participate as an honest broker and tell us what you think and what is of value to you, you will see it reflected in the project. You won't get everything you want. No one does. The real estate developer doesn't get everything they want. But if we have an honest process, the things that are of value to you will be evident and will be important. And you need to live with that and live with the fact that nobody gets everything they want. And I think what Yusuf started talking about, you know, the destruction and violence happens when those power dynamics are totally out of kilter, and that the planning and urban design are used to pursue an unbalanced political agenda, just the same way military force is used. And I think, you know, a lot of what at least I've done professionally has been painful. It's been difficult. It's been tedious, but in the end, worth it, because you end up with an authenticity, if you do it right, of something that communities can value. And I really think that when we think about the reconstruction of Gaza or other places that are seeing war-torn suffering and whatnot, I think that that's the only way forward. That is the only way forward. Otherwise, you end up with a power dynamic that is unbalanced. And you know, that's been my experience anyhow. All right, any
That
last
brings us
thought?
to time here.
Yeah, can I just let everybody hold on one second. And Uma, any last thoughts quickly?